David never believed in ghosts, until that night in the abandoned asylum. The air was thick with a stench of decay, and whispers echoed through the empty corridors. Then he saw it. A figure standing at the end of the hall, motionless, staring straight at him. David had always been skeptical of the supernatural. He prided himself on being a man of logic, someone who sought explanations for everything. So, when his friend Mark dared him to spend a night inside the abandoned Blackwood Asylum, he laughed it off. Ghosts? Come on, Mark. That place is just an old, crumbling building. But Mark grinned, shaking his head. Then prove it. Stay there from midnight to sunrise. Alone. The challenge was simple, and David wasn't one to back down. On a cold Friday night, he arrived at Blackwood Asylum with nothing but a flashlight, his phone, and a bottle of water. The building loomed before him, its Gothic structure weathered by time. Cracked windows, ivy-covered walls, and a heavy, iron gate that groaned as he pushed it open. As soon as he stepped inside, an unnatural silence surrounded him. The asylum had been abandoned for decades after reports of inhumane experiments on patients. Legends spoke of tortured souls wandering its halls, screaming in agony. David rolled his eyes. Just stories. He turned on his flashlight, sweeping it across the vast, dust-covered entrance hall. The air smelled of mildew and rot, the floor littered with broken glass and debris. A grand staircase stood in the middle, leading up into darkness. Doors lined the walls, some barely hanging on their hinges. A sudden thud echoed from somewhere deep inside the building. David froze. His pulse quickened, but he forced a smirk. Probably just an animal. Ignoring the sound, he moved forward, stepping carefully over fallen beams and shattered tiles. He reached a rusted metal sign on the wall, its faded letters barely legible. Ward C, high-risk patients. His stomach tightened. He had read about Ward C, where the most violent patients were kept in solitary confinement. Many of them had died under mysterious circumstances, and some were never accounted for. As he continued down the corridor, a chill ran down his spine. The temperature dropped suddenly, his breath visible in the dim light. His flashlight flickered. "Great," he muttered, tapping it. Then a whisper. Faint, almost indistinguishable, like wind through broken windows. But this was different. It was a voice. David. His heart slammed against his ribs. He whipped around, his light sweeping over empty hallways. His name. Someone had just whispered his name. That was impossible. He took a step back, his foot crunching on glass. The whisper came again, this time closer. "David, help us." A shiver crawled up his spine. He turned and walked faster, forcing himself not to run. But then footsteps. Not his. Someone or something was following him. He spun around, flashlight trembling in his grip. Nothing. Just the empty, decaying hallway. Bang! A door slammed shut behind him. He jumped, his breath ragged. His instincts screamed at him to leave, but his pride wouldn't let him. He stepped forward, reaching for the door handle, when he saw it. At the end of the hallway, a shadow stood motionless. Tall, unmoving, watching. David's throat tightened. He couldn't see a face, just a dark silhouette. It didn't move, didn't breathe. Yet, he felt it staring deep into him. His fingers clenched around the flashlight as he forced himself to speak. "Who's there?" Silence. Then the figure moved, but not like a person. It glided, smooth and soundless, closer. David stumbled backward, his mind screaming at him to run, but his body was frozen. The air grew heavier, suffocating, as the shadow loomed over him. A cold breath against his ear. "You shouldn't have come." His scream died in his throat as the lights went out. David's heart pounded in his chest as the world around him dissolved into darkness. His breath was shallow, his hands trembling as he fumbled for his phone. The flashlight flickered once more, casting long, crooked shadows across the walls. The figure was gone. For a moment, he thought he imagined it. He stood still, trying to steady his breath, listening intently to the absolute silence. Nothing moved. No whispers. No footsteps. Just the echo of his own heartbeat in his ears. But then the whispers returned. This time they were louder, clearer. A chorus of voices, each one distinct, yet hauntingly the same. "Help us!" David's skin crawled. He spun around, but saw nothing in the blackness. He felt his way through the pitch-black hallway, every creak and groan of the asylum seeming to taunt him. He could still hear them, soft, pleading whispers coming from the walls themselves. The air around him felt dense, almost suffocating. He pulled his phone from his pocket, desperate for some light, but the screen remained black. Panic set in. He was trapped in complete darkness with no way to see or escape. "Focus," he muttered to himself. "Just focus. Find the exit." He knew the layout of the asylum from old blueprints he'd found online, but now it all seemed foreign. The long, narrow corridors stretched endlessly in every direction. Every door, every window, was a reminder of the insanity this place had once housed. Suddenly, he heard a scraping sound, soft, deliberate. He whipped around, his heart hammering. A door at the end of the hall opened with a slow, agonizing creak. The door toward C. David froze. He had to leave. He had to get out. But something about the door, something about that sound, compelled him to go closer. The voices were louder now, all around him. Whispers, gasps, muffled cries, pleas for help. "Help us! Please!" It was no longer just one voice. It was a crowd of them, pressing in on him from every direction. As he moved closer to the door, the temperature dropped even further. His breath fogged in front of him, his body shaking from the cold and fear. He reached out, his fingers brushing the door handle. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Without thinking, he twisted the handle and pushed the door open. Inside, the room was pitch black. His flashlight flickered again, its weak beam cutting through the darkness just enough to reveal what was inside. A single, rusted bed frame lay in the corner. The floor was covered in debris, old papers, broken glass, and torn remnants of what looked like a hospital gown. The walls were stained, cracked, and crumbling. But it was the mirror that caught his attention. It stood against the far wall, its surface cracked, reflecting only a distorted version of the room. There was something wrong about it. It wasn't just the cracks or the dirt. It felt like the mirror was alive. David stepped forward, his eyes locked on the reflection. The room seemed to pulse, the darkness shifting unnaturally. He moved closer, his reflection distorted in the shattered glass. But as he leaned in to examine it, his heart stopped. A figure appeared, not in the room, but in the reflection. A woman. Her face was pale, gaunt, eyes hollow and dark. Her hair hung in matted clumps around her face, as though she had been trapped in this place for years. But what terrified him most was the smile. A twisted, haunting grin that stretched far too wide. Before he could pull away, the reflection moved, as if reaching toward him. The woman's hand slammed against the glass. David stumbled back, his heart racing. But the hand was still there, pressing against the surface, as though the woman was trying to break through. His mouth went dry. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The voices in the room grew louder, more desperate. He needed to get out now. He turned to run, but the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. He was trapped. The whispers became screams. "David!" Suddenly, the room began to shake. The walls creaked and groaned as if the building itself was alive, thrashing in agony. The floor beneath him buckled. David's legs gave way as the ground trembled violently beneath him. His body hit the floor with a sickening thud. For a brief moment, everything went silent again. And then the whispers returned, louder, more insistent. But this time, there was only one voice. "You can't escape." David's pulse raced. He scrambled to his feet, his fingers clawing at the door, but it wouldn't budge. The walls seemed to close in around him. He was trapped, surrounded by voices, and the reflection of the woman with the twisted grin. David's heart raced as he desperately yanked at the door handle. The walls around him seemed to pulse with a life of their own, groaning as if they were alive, suffocating him in their grip. His mind screamed at him to escape, but no matter how hard he pushed, the door refused to open. The whispers, no, the screams, had grown louder. They clawed at his mind, a chorus of tortured souls pleading for release. "David, please, you have to listen." The voice was no longer just a whisper. It was a command. David stumbled back, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. His eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of hope. But there was nothing, just the dark corners, the decaying walls, and that cursed mirror. He turned toward it again, compelled to look. The woman's reflection was still there. She stood motionless in the glass, staring at him with those hollow, dark eyes. Her twisted grin had grown wider, her mouth stretching in unnatural proportions. The hand was still pressed against the surface, as though trying to push through. David tried to pull his gaze away, but it was like the mirror had a hold on him. His feet moved unwillingly toward it. "You shouldn't have come." The voice was louder this time, echoing through the room like a bell tolling for his fate. David couldn't escape it. He couldn't stop himself from moving closer. The air felt heavy, thick with the stench of rot and decay. He reached out, his fingers trembling, and placed his hand against the mirror. The coldness of it sent a jolt of ice through his veins, but still, he couldn't pull away. His reflection, no, the woman's reflection, stared back at him. Suddenly, the glass began to ripple. At first, it was subtle, like water disturbed by a gentle breeze. But then the ripples grew larger, more violent. The woman in the mirror moved, her body jerking unnaturally, her grin now a grotesque, jagged smile. Her eyes locked onto David, and for the first time, he saw malice in them. Without warning, the glass seemed to shatter. But there was no sound. The mirror fractured, its cracks spreading outward, as if the reflection itself was breaking apart. Then the woman's hand, her real hand, emerged through the cracks. David recoiled in horror as the hand reached out of the mirror, its long, bony fingers curling toward him. The skin was pale, decaying, as if it had been dead for years. He turned to run. He had to get out, but the walls seemed to close in. The corridor had disappeared. It was as if the asylum was shifting around him, warping and twisting in ways that defied reality. The ceiling above him lowered, and the floor beneath him cracked open, revealing a deep chasm. He couldn't see an escape. The building was alive in a way he couldn't understand. It was trying to keep him there. The woman's hand continued to reach for him. She was closer now. Her fingers brushed his ankle, cold and clammy. David screamed, pulling his foot back, but it was too late. A cold, wet grip wrapped around his leg, pulling him toward the mirror. "No!" David shouted, struggling against the pull. The mirror's surface rippled again, and the woman's distorted face appeared behind him. Her lips parted in a grotesque mockery of a smile. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, staring into his soul. "You can't run from us." The words reverberated in his mind, louder and louder, until it felt like his skull would crack open from the pressure. His vision blurred as the world around him spun, the ground falling away beneath him. With one final scream, David felt himself pulled into the mirror. The world went black. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer in the asylum. He was in a different place, a place of shadows and whispers of endless darkness. His hands trembled as he tried to move, but it was as if the air itself held him in place. He couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything, except for the voices, those same voices surrounding him. "David, welcome." The whisper echoed all around him, reverberating in the void. But the voice wasn't coming from any one direction. It was coming from everywhere. He turned in circles, trying to find the source. But there was nothing, just darkness. And then in the distance he saw it. A faint light. David ran toward it, his feet moving on their own, as if the darkness itself was guiding him. He reached the light and found himself standing before a door. A door that led somewhere, anywhere, but away from the suffocating dark. With shaking hands, he grabbed the doorknob and twisted it open. But what he saw on the other side was worse than anything he had imagined. A room filled with mirrors. Endless mirrors, stretching beyond what his eyes could comprehend. And in each one, David saw a reflection of himself. But these weren't just his reflections. They were the other Davids. The ones who had stayed behind. The ones who had been claimed by the asylum. And they were staring at him, reaching out, their hands pressed against the glass. "Join us," David screamed. David's heart pounded in his chest as he stumbled backward, his eyes wide with terror. The reflections, the other Davids, were still there, pressing their hands against the mirrors, their faces twisted in a mix of sorrow and madness. They weren't just reflections anymore. They were alive, reaching out to him as if they could pull him into their nightmarish world. "No, this can't be real." David gasped, his voice barely a whisper. He tried to back away, but the door slammed shut behind him, trapping him in the room of mirrors. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, the cold sinking deep into his bones. The mirrors began to tremble, their surfaces rippling as if they were made of water. And then the reflections began to move. Not just their hands, their bodies, as though the very essence of those trapped souls was pouring out of the glass, crawling toward him. Their eyes locked onto his, filled with a hunger that made his stomach churn. "Help! Help me!" One of the reflections moaned, its voice echoing in every direction. David tried to scream, but the words stuck in his throat. His legs felt like lead, each step he took toward the door feeling heavier than the last. The reflections were getting closer, and their twisted expressions grew more frantic. Suddenly, one of them stepped forward, the original David, the one who had stood in the mirror since the beginning. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, but there was something in his gaze, something familiar. "David," the figure whispered, its voice a soft, eerie rasp. You don't have much time. They're coming for you. David felt his breath catch in his throat. Who? Who's coming? The figure reached out, its hand pressing against the mirror's surface. For a moment, their fingers almost touched. And then the mirror shattered. Glass flew everywhere, but David didn't flinch. He couldn't. His eyes were locked onto the figure standing before him. It was as though the world had frozen, the fragments of the mirror hanging suspended in midair. The figure stepped through the broken glass, no longer confined to the reflection. It was real. David's heart skipped a beat. You're not real, he cried out, his voice shaking. The figure smiled, but it wasn't a reassuring smile. It was a mocking grin, the kind you'd expect from a predator. Oh, I'm real, David. And I've been waiting for you. Before David could react, the other reflections began to stir, crawling out of the shattered glass. They moved with unnatural speed, their limbs jerking and twisting in grotesque motions. They were alive, but not in the way a human was. They were cursed. David turned to run, but the room seemed to close in on him. The mirrors, once broken, were now whole again, their surfaces reflecting his every movement, trapping him in a nightmarish maze. Every mirror was a door to another version of himself, each one more distorted, more twisted than the last. Some of the Davids smiled cruelly, while others reached out as though they could pull him into their glassy prisons. Their whispers filled his ears all at once. You belong with us. It's too late to run, David. We're coming for you. David's mind raced as he tried to figure out how to escape. He couldn't think, couldn't breathe. The air was thick, suffocating, and the shadows in the mirrors were alive. They moved and shifted, pulling him in every direction. Desperation flooded his mind. There had to be a way out. There had to be. A voice, cold and commanding, echoed through the chaos. David. He whipped around to face the source, but there was no one there. Just the mirrors, reflecting every fear, every nightmare he had ever known. David, don't fight it. You can't escape. The figure, the first David, emerged again, his face twisted in agony. He was no longer smiling. His eyes, once hollow, now burned with a fiery intensity. They've already found you. It's over. David shook his head violently. No, I can't. I can't end up like you. But the figure's smile returned, this time cruel and mocking. You already have. The room seemed to tilt as the ground beneath David cracked open. He fell to his knees, gasping for air. The air was thick with the stench of decay. The whispers grew louder, overwhelming him. He couldn't think. He couldn't fight it. And then everything went silent. The mirrors were still. The voices faded. David opened his eyes, unsure of how long he had been unconscious. But when he looked around, the room was different. The mirrors were gone. The walls were cracked and peeling, but there was a door at the far end of the room. He was still in the asylum, but the mirrors had taken him somewhere else. David stood up, shaking, his body trembling. He stumbled toward the door, hoping, praying, that this was the way out. But as he reached for the handle, he heard it. A low, growling whisper, so close to his ear it felt like breath on his skin. You can't leave, David. The door swung open on its own, revealing a pitch-black hallway. And standing at the end, bathed in darkness, was the first David. You'll never leave. David froze. And in that moment he knew. He was trapped. David's heart slammed against his chest, the sound deafening in his ears. The figure of the first David, standing at the end of the dark hallway, seemed to mock him. The air was thick with an oppressive, suffocating darkness, and every instinct screamed at him to run, to escape. But there was nowhere to go. You can't leave, David, the voice echoed again, its low, guttural growl vibrating through his bones. The shadows around the figure seemed to pulse and shift, as though they were alive, reaching out toward him. David swallowed hard, his body frozen in place. His mind raced, desperate for an escape plan, but the only thing that came to mind was the terrifying truth. He was trapped. His eyes darted around the hallway, searching for any hint of a way out. The walls were cracked, peeling like old skin, and the ceiling seemed to sag, as though it might collapse at any moment. The air smelled of mildew and decay, but most terrifying of all was the silence. The suffocating, oppressive silence that hung in the air, broken only by the sound of his own breathing. The figure of the first David took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate. With every step it took, the temperature in the room dropped, and the shadows deepened. David forced himself to take a step back, his breath shallow. No, I won't stay here. But his feet felt like they were glued to the floor. It was as if the very ground beneath him was trying to swallow him whole. His heart raced, his palms slick with sweat, as he fought the overwhelming urge to scream, to fight back. But all his strength had been drained. "You're just like me now, David." The figure's voice was almost gentle, like a whisper from the past. "You can't escape what's inside you. You've already crossed the line. There's no going back." David shook his head violently. "I'm nothing like you." His voice cracked, but there was a desperation in it that cut through the thick, heavy silence. "I don't belong here. I don't." But before he could finish, the figure raised a hand, and the darkness around them seemed to pulse, growing stronger, thicker, suffocating. "It's already too late for that." The first David's eyes glowed with an eerie light, burning with an unnatural intensity. "You've been marked. You've been chosen." David's mind spun. Chosen? What did that even mean? He was losing himself in this nightmare, each passing second dragging him deeper into something he couldn't understand. The figure stepped closer, its hand reaching out as though to grab him. David took another step back, his legs trembling with fear. But then something strange happened. The darkness that had once seemed so suffocating began to shift. It wasn't just shadows anymore. It was something more tangible, like a living thing, wrapping itself around him, pulling him in. The walls of the hallway seemed to stretch and contort, the room warping as though it were breathing. David gasped, his hands flying to his head as he tried to steady himself. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. But the more he resisted, the more the world around him seemed to fight back. The floor beneath his feet cracked open, and for a moment, he thought he was going to fall straight into the abyss. Then he heard it, a whisper, so faint he almost missed it. "Run." It was a voice he didn't recognize, but it felt familiar. Like a faint echo from a forgotten memory. David's heart skipped a beat. Run. But where? How? In that instant, his instincts kicked in. He didn't think. He didn't question. He turned and ran. Down the hallway toward the door. His feet pounded against the cracked floor, the darkness following him, chasing him like a living beast. The whispers grew louder, faster. They echoed from all directions, filling his mind with a cacophony of voices. "You can't escape. You belong to us. You're one of us now." David ignored them, pushing forward, the cold air biting at his skin. The door, the only exit, was just ahead, but it seemed like it was getting farther away, as if the hallway itself was stretching, pulling him further into its depths. His breath came in ragged gasps, his vision blurred with fear. The door was almost within reach when suddenly a hand, cold like ice, shot out of the shadows and grabbed his ankle. David screamed, trying to shake it off, but the grip tightened, pulling him down. He kicked, desperately trying to break free, but the hand wouldn't let go. It was like it had a mind of its own, like it was feeding on his fear. His mind screamed for him to fight, to break free, but the more he struggled, the tighter the grip became. His heart raced as he realized that whatever was holding him was stronger than he could ever be. And then, just as all hope seemed lost, he heard it again. The same voice. Faint but clear. "Run." Without thinking, David twisted his body and kicked hard. His foot collided with the hand, and with a sickening crack, the grip loosened. He tore himself free, stumbling forward, nearly falling as he reached the door. He was out. The hallway behind him seemed to fade into the shadows, its dark presence still lingering in his mind. He gasped for air, his pulse racing as he backed away from the door, unsure of where he was or how he had escaped. But when he looked around, he realized something terrifying. He was no longer in the hallway. The world around him was completely different, dark, empty, and full of whispers. And standing in front of him, in the thick blackness, was the first David. You can't run forever. David's blood ran cold. The nightmare was far from over. The cold wind howled through the cracked window, its eerie whispers swirling around David as he stood frozen, his heart racing. He had just stepped into the mansion, but it already felt like something was wrong, like an invisible force was watching him. The silence was thick and suffocating, each footstep he took seeming louder than the last. He glanced around, his eyes struggling to adjust to the dim light. The walls were adorned with faded paintings, their once vibrant colors now dull and worn. Dust hung in the air, catching the faint light from the cracked windows. The floor creaked under his weight, adding to the oppressive atmosphere of the place. "Where is everyone?" David muttered to himself, his voice barely above a whisper. It was as if the entire house had been abandoned for years, and yet there was a strange feeling like something, or someone, was still here waiting. His hands trembled as he reached for his flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. He shone it across the room, but all it illuminated were old furniture and the remains of forgotten memories. A grandfather clock stood against one wall, its pendulum motionless. It was as though time had stopped here, suspended in the grip of something far more sinister. David continued moving, his breath shallow and uneven. He had come to this place looking for answers, but now, every step felt like a mistake. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, but something kept him going, something he couldn't explain. As he moved deeper into the mansion, the air grew colder. The temperature seemed to drop with each step, his breath now visible in the dim light. A faint sound, almost imperceptible, echoed from somewhere ahead. It was a soft rustling, like footsteps on the floorboards. David froze, his pulse quickening. He wasn't alone. He had known it from the moment he stepped in, but hearing it made it real. He slowly turned toward the sound, shining his flashlight into the darkness. The beam danced across the walls, revealing nothing but empty rooms. But then he saw it, a figure standing at the end of the hallway. For a moment, David thought his mind was playing tricks on him. The figure was blurry, distorted, like a shadow of a person rather than a solid form. It seemed to flicker, shifting in and out of focus. "Hello," David called out, his voice shaky. "Is someone there?" No response. The figure just stood there, motionless, its outline barely visible in the dark. David's heart raced. He knew he should run, but his feet felt glued to the floor. The pull of curiosity and fear kept him rooted in place, unable to turn away. He took a step forward, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The figure remained still, and with each step he took, it seemed to grow clearer, more defined. As he got closer, the figure's features slowly became visible, its face gaunt and pale, eyes sunken deep into its skull. It was a face he had seen before, in nightmares and memories he couldn't place. David's breath caught in his throat. The figure was him. A chill ran down his spine as he stepped back, the light from the flashlight flickering. The figure mirrored his every movement, its eyes locked onto his. He reached out to touch the wall for support, but his hand met only cold air. No, this can't be real," he whispered to himself, his mind spiraling. He couldn't move. He couldn't think. He just stood there, frozen in place as the figure began to walk toward him. The closer it got, the more David could feel its presence, a heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on him. His heart pounded in his chest as the figure came to a stop just inches away. Its eyes bored into him, unblinking and empty. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure whispered, its voice low and raspy, echoing in the empty hall. David's eyes widened. The words were a warning, but they felt too familiar, as though he had heard them before. He tried to speak, but no words came out. His throat was dry, his tongue heavy. I don't understand," David managed to croak. "Who are you?" The figure tilted its head slightly, as if considering the question. "I am you," it said simply. "Or rather, you are me. We are the same. You've been here before, David. You've seen this place." David's knees buckled, and he stumbled backward, his breath coming in short gasps. This wasn't possible. He hadn't been here before. He had never seen this house, never felt this overwhelming sense of dread. And yet, there was something about it, something that gnawed at him, something that made his chest tighten with fear. The figure stepped closer, its eyes never leaving his. "You can't escape your past," it said, its voice growing colder. "This house is a prison, and you're its prisoner." David backed away, his mind reeling. He didn't know what this place was, but the figure seemed to know him, seemed to know his deepest fears. The walls felt like they were closing in, the shadows pressing against him, suffocating him. No, this isn't me," David protested, his voice barely audible. But the figure didn't respond. Instead, it reached out, its fingers curling into a grotesque claw, and touched David's face. The moment the cold, dead hand made contact, a surge of images flooded David's mind. Memories, fragments of his past, flickered before his eyes. Pain, guilt, loss, fear. All the things he had tried to forget, buried deep within him, were now rushing to the surface. "You can't run from what you are," the figure whispered, its voice now a distant echo. "You can never escape yourself." David screamed, his body jerking awake as the world around him shifted violently. The shadows, the figure, the mansion, it all dissolved into a blur. He gasped for air, disoriented and panicked, as the feeling of being trapped clung to him. But when he looked around, he was back in the hallway, the figure gone. The mansion was silent again, the cold creeping into his bones. He was no closer to the truth, but now the question lingered in his mind. Was he the one being haunted, or was he the one haunting himself? David's breath came in short, ragged bursts as he stood face to face with the figure of the first David. The oppressive darkness surrounded him, each whisper like a dagger that sliced through the silence. The figure's eyes burned into him, glowing with an intensity that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. "You think you've escaped, but you're still trapped, David." The first David's voice echoed, low and mocking, its tone colder than the air around him. David's legs shook, but he refused to back down. He had escaped the hallway, or at least he thought he had, but now he found himself standing in a place even darker, even more suffocating. He glanced around, hoping to find an exit, but all he saw were endless shadows stretching in every direction. "Where am I?" David's voice cracked as he spoke, his words barely audible over the growing noise of the whispers. "What is this place?" The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it took a slow step forward, its presence looming over David like a storm cloud ready to burst. The shadows around them seemed to pulse and breathe, alive with a malevolent energy. "This place is where you belong." The first David's voice was now a low growl, as if it had become part of the very air around them. "You can't escape it. You're bound to it now, just like me. You'll never get out. Not alive. Asterisk asterisk." David's pulse raced. There was a heavy weight in the air, a sense of finality, as though everything had led to this moment. Every step he had taken, every choice he had made, had led him here. He could feel the cold creeping into his bones, dragging him down with it. No, that's not true." David's voice trembled, but he stood his ground, the faint spark of defiance still burning within him. "I'm not like you." The first David tilted its head, a sinister smile creeping across its face. "Oh, but you are. You've crossed the line. There's no going back, David. You're already one of us. Asterisk asterisk." David's heart pounded in his chest as the shadows closed in, suffocating him. He could feel them, crawling under his skin, wrapping around his throat, choking the air from his lungs. It was as if the darkness itself wanted to consume him, to pull him into the abyss. "What do you want from me?" David gasped, his voice barely a whisper, swallowed by the growing darkness. He wanted to fight back, to break free from this nightmare, but it was becoming harder to think, harder to breathe. The world around him was warping, twisting, as if the very reality he knew was unraveling before his eyes. The figure of the first David stepped closer, the shadows parting around it like a path to hell. "What I want doesn't matter, David." Its voice was colder now, colder than anything David had ever felt. "What matters is what you're willing to do to survive." David's breath caught in his throat. His eyes darted around, searching for something, anything that could help him. The whispers were growing louder, now like a cacophony of voices, all urging him to give in, to embrace the darkness. It was overwhelming, suffocating. "I don't want this." David's voice broke, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "I don't want to be like you." The figure chuckled, the sound sharp and cruel. "You already are." The shadows surged forward, wrapping around David's arms, pulling him toward the figure. His body felt heavy, weighed down by the darkness, and he struggled against it, but it was futile. The more he fought, the tighter the shadows clung to him, until he couldn't move. "You can't run from yourself, David." The first David's voice was almost gentle now, as if it were trying to comfort him. "The darkness is inside you, and it will always be." David's heart sank. There was no escape from this. The figure's words echoed in his mind, twisting and warping into a horrific truth he couldn't deny. The darkness, the fear, the nightmare, it was a part of him now. A flash of memories surged through his mind, his past, his regrets, his mistakes. The things he had tried so hard to bury. The mistakes that had led him here. They flooded his thoughts, suffocating him, drowning him in guilt. "Please let me go." David's voice was barely audible, a soft plea that seemed to vanish into the dark void. But the first David only smiled, the glow in its eyes brightening. "You've never truly been free, David. Not since the moment you stepped into this place." David's mind raced. He was running out of time, out of options. The darkness was closing in, suffocating him, and he could feel the weight of it pressing down on his chest. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The whispers were overwhelming, and the figure's presence felt like a heavy hand on his soul. And then, just as he thought he might break, a single thought pierced through the chaos. What if the only way out was to embrace the darkness? The thought terrified him, but it also offered a strange sense of clarity. If he couldn't escape, maybe the only way to survive was to stop fighting it. To give in. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "I won't let you win." The first David's smile faded, and the shadows began to recede. For a brief moment, David thought he had succeeded. But just as quickly, the shadows lunged forward again, more powerful than before. You can never escape. The first David's voice was low and final, its presence overwhelming. You are mine now. David was pulled into the darkness, his body feeling like it was being torn apart, consumed by the shadows. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed whole by the void. And in that moment, he realized the terrible truth. There was no escape. David's body felt like it was suspended in the void, weightless and yet crushed under the pressure of the darkness. The world around him was nothing but an endless expanse of black, stretching out into infinity. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. The shadows clung to him like a second skin, their coldness seeping into his bones, drowning him in their suffocating embrace. His thoughts were disjointed, fragments of memories and images flickering in and out of focus. He could barely remember who he was, where he had come from. Everything felt distant, as if he were drifting away from himself. And then a voice, soft like a whisper in the wind, pierced through the overwhelming silence. David. The voice was familiar, but distant, as if it were coming from somewhere far away. He tried to focus on it, but the shadows kept tugging at his mind, pulling him deeper into the darkness. David, you have to wake up. The voice grew louder, more insistent. This isn't real. None of this is real. David's heart skipped a beat. It sounded like, no, it couldn't be. His mind was playing tricks on him. He had to focus. He had to wake up. Please help me. David gasped, the words barely escaping his throat. Who are you? Where am I? The darkness seemed to pulse around him, as if the shadows themselves were listening, reacting to his words. The figure of the first David stood in front of him again, its eyes glowing with a terrifying intensity. You can't escape. The figure's voice was cold, almost mechanical. This is your reality now. There's no going back. David felt a wave of despair wash over him. It was as if the weight of the world had crashed down on him all at once. His body felt like it was being crushed under an unbearable weight. His mind was slipping, becoming consumed by the darkness. But then a flicker of light, a memory, flashed before his eyes. It was his mother's face. He could see her so clearly, her eyes full of warmth and love. He remembered the way she would hold him when he was scared, the way she would comfort him in times of trouble. No, David's voice was shaking but firm. I won't let this happen. The first David sneered, stepping closer, its figure towering over him. You think you have a choice, it growled. You're nothing. Just a pawn in this endless game. David clenched his fists, his anger rising. He refused to believe that this was the end. He refused to accept that he was just another lost soul in the darkness. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder. 1,000 voices, all speaking at once, filled the air. They were the voices of everyone who had ever been trapped in this place. The voices of those who had failed, who had given in to the darkness. You're one of us now. The voices chanted, their tone growing more insistent. You can never leave. David's head spun. The walls of reality seemed to blur, his mind struggling to hold on to any sense of self. The darkness was closing in, and he felt as though he was being swallowed by it, piece by piece. But then the light from his memory, the image of his mother, flared up again, brighter this time. It was like a beacon in the darkness, a spark of hope in the face of everything that was trying to destroy him. I'm not like you, David shouted, his voice echoing through the void. I'm not a part of this. The first David's eyes narrowed, the mocking smile fading from its face. You can scream all you want. It laughed, a hollow, empty sound. It won't change anything. David's mind raced. The darkness was so close now. It was as if every inch of him was being consumed by it, every thought, every breath slipping away. The figure loomed over him, its presence suffocating. He couldn't fight it forever. He knew that. But then, as if by some force beyond his control, something within him snapped. The spark of hope, the memory of his mother, ignited a fire inside him, and he surged forward, pushing against the darkness with every ounce of strength he had left. I will fight you, David cried out, his voice breaking through the cacophony of whispers. I won't give in. The first David recoiled, its form flickering like a dying flame. The shadows seemed to waver, as if they were losing their grip on him. For the first time, David felt as though he had some control over his fate. But it wasn't over yet. The darkness lashed out, furious, desperate to claim him. The shadows twisted and writhed, forming shapes that were barely recognizable. They reached for him, their cold, clammy hands closing in around him. David gasped, his heart racing. He couldn't keep fighting forever. But just as the darkness was about to engulf him, a voice, a new voice, sharp and clear, cut through the chaos. "Wake up!" David's eyes snapped open, and he gasped, inhaling air as if he had been drowning. The world around him was no longer a swirling mass of shadows. He was back in the hallway, standing in front of the mirror. But everything had changed. The mirror was cracked, shattered, as if it had been broken from the inside out. And the figure of the first David was gone. David's heart pounded in his chest. What had just happened? Was it real? Or had it all been a nightmare? The lingering sense of dread in the air told him that there was more to this place than he could understand. But for now, he was alive. And that was enough. David's heart was pounding in his chest, his mind racing. It felt like he was losing touch with reality, like the lines between his past, present, and the nightmare he was trapped in were all blurring. Every step he took seemed to draw him deeper into the mansion, yet the walls, the floors, the air, everything around him felt like it was closing in, suffocating him. He had come looking for answers, but what he found instead was an ever-growing sense of dread. The figure, the voice, the eerie sensation that he was being watched, it was all too much. But still, something inside him pushed him forward, as if this journey, this horror, was somehow meant to be. He couldn't turn back now. The hallway stretched endlessly before him, its dim light flickering ominously. The shadows seemed to shift with his every movement, as if they were alive, watching, waiting. He stopped for a moment, his breath shallow and ragged. The mansion was silent, too silent. The only sound was the echo of his own footsteps. David's flashlight flickered once more, casting strange, elongated shadows on the walls. He tightened his grip on it, trying to steady himself, but as the light flashed across a mirror at the end of the hallway, he froze. The reflection staring back at him was not his own. It was him, but not him. The man in the mirror had a different look in his eyes, empty, hollow. His face was gaunt, pale, with deep shadows around his eyes. It was like looking at a version of himself that had been stripped of all life, all emotion. The image sent a cold shiver down his spine. He quickly turned away, but the reflection lingered in his mind, as though it were etched into his very soul. He tried to rationalize it, but the feeling of being watched, of being haunted, was growing stronger. As David moved forward, the house seemed to shift around him. The walls stretched, the floors creaked louder, and the air grew thicker. He could feel it now, the presence, the weight of something ancient and malevolent. The house wasn't just old. It was alive. A soft sound reached his ears, a whisper barely audible, but there. He paused, listening intently. It came again, this time clearer, like a voice calling from deep within the walls. "Help me," it whispered, a voice so faint yet so desperate. David's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't alone. The voice seemed to echo from the walls, surrounding him. He turned in every direction, trying to locate its source, but there was nothing. Just the endless, oppressive silence of the mansion. "Who's there?" David called out, his voice trembling. There was no answer, but the whisper continued, growing louder, more insistent. "Help me, help me." David's hands shook as he wiped the sweat from his brow. Something wasn't right. He had to find out what was happening in this house. He had to understand the horrors it was hiding. He moved toward the source of the sound, his footsteps quickening, the desire to escape overpowering his fear. As he rounded the corner, he was struck by a sudden, overwhelming sense of vertigo. The hallway stretched impossibly long, the walls bending in unnatural ways. The house was shifting again. And then, through the distortion, David saw something. A door, partially open, glowing with a faint, eerie light. It beckoned him, pulling him closer. He reached for the door handle, his fingers trembling. The moment his hand made contact with the cold metal, the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. With a deep breath, David pushed the door open. Inside was a room unlike anything he had seen in the mansion before. It was small, cramped, and filled with old furniture covered in sheets. But at the far end of the room was a large, ornate mirror. Its surface was cracked, but it still reflected the room as if it were intact. David stepped forward, his gaze locked on the mirror. He couldn't explain why, but something drew him toward it. As he approached, the air grew colder, and the shadows around him seemed to deepen. And then he saw it. The reflection wasn't his own this time. It was something else. A figure, dressed in tattered clothes, hair wild and unkempt, face twisted in a silent scream. It was a woman, but her eyes were hollow, empty, like a void. She stared at him, her expression frozen in terror. David recoiled, his heart racing. He took a step back, but the figure in the mirror didn't move. It remained there, staring at him, trapped behind the cracked glass. Suddenly, the room seemed to shift again. The walls closed in, the floor beneath his feet started to tremble. He was no longer alone. There were whispers, low and guttural, rising from the cracks in the walls. The air thickened with dread. David turned and ran, his mind racing with questions. Who was the woman in the mirror? What was happening in this house? Was he the one being haunted, or was he slowly losing his grip on reality? As he fled, he could hear her voice, faint but clear, whispering from the depths of the mansion. "Help me." But this time, he couldn't tell if the voice was from the woman in the mirror, or if it was coming from somewhere else, somewhere deeper, darker, where the true horror of the mansion waited. David stumbled through the hallways, his breath ragged and his body trembling. The house seemed to be alive, its walls shifting, its floors creaking and groaning as if it were breathing with him. Every corner he turned only seemed to lead him deeper into the nightmare, and the whispers, those terrifying guttural whispers, followed him like a shadow, growing louder with every step. He didn't know how much longer he could endure this. His mind was on the edge of breaking, and the image of the woman in the mirror haunted him, her hollow eyes following him in every reflection. But it wasn't just the woman. There was something else, something darker, lurking within the mansion. The presence he had felt earlier was now undeniable. It was as if the house was feeding off his fear, growing stronger with each passing moment. He found himself back at the entrance hall, though he didn't recognize how he got there. The door, the one he had entered through, was now sealed shut, the lock twisted and bent as if it had been warped by some invisible force. The air was thick, suffocating, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch unnaturally, reaching out toward him. David turned around, trying to make sense of his surroundings. Everything seemed wrong. The mansion was no longer the place he had wandered into hours ago. It was as if he had stepped into a twisted version of reality, where nothing made sense, and every step took him further away from his own sanity. The walls, once decorated with old portraits, now displayed images of horrific scenes, blood-soaked floors, twisted bodies, and eyes that seemed to follow him as he moved. He tried not to look at them, but their presence was inescapable. His mind was reeling, each image more disturbing than the last, blurring the line between nightmare and reality. David's grip tightened on the flashlight as he moved cautiously, trying to push past the overwhelming sense of dread that seemed to settle on his chest like a weight he couldn't escape. Then, from the corner of his eye, something caught his attention. A figure, a shadowy, indistinct shape, lurking at the edge of his vision. He whipped around, but it was gone, as if it had melted back into the shadows of the mansion. "Hello," David called out, his voice wavering in the silent, oppressive air. No response. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone in this place, that something, someone, was always watching him, waiting for the moment when his fear would consume him. Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted, and a chill ran down his spine. His breath became visible in the cold air, each exhale coming out in small, white clouds. The whispers returned, now more distinct, rising from the shadows like a chorus of tortured souls. "Help me, help me." David's heart pounded in his chest, the sound echoing in his ears. He turned frantically, trying to locate the source of the voice, but the room seemed to distort and stretch, becoming a maze of endless hallways. He had to get out. He had to find a way to break free from this nightmare. But no matter how fast he moved, the mansion felt like it was closing in on him, trapping him in its twisted grasp. A door, an open door at the end of the hallway, caught his attention. It was dimly lit, a soft, unnatural glow emanating from the crack beneath it. He didn't hesitate. He ran toward it, his footsteps echoing in the silence. As he pushed the door open, a wave of cold air hit him. The room was unlike any other he had seen in the mansion. It was smaller, almost claustrophobic, with walls covered in thick, black soot and ancient symbols carved into the stone. In the center of the room was a large, weathered altar, bloodstains darkening its surface. David's pulse quickened as he stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of decay and something far worse, a stench that made his stomach churn. But it was the altar that captured his attention. The symbols etched into the stone seemed to pulse, glowing faintly as if alive. There was something ancient here, something dark and powerful. A sensation of dread washed over him, urging him to leave, but he couldn't. He had to understand. He had to know what was happening. As his eyes scanned the room, they landed on something that made his blood run cold. A book lying open on the altar, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. The text was in a language David didn't recognize, but the symbols were the same ones carved into the walls. There was something about the book, something that drew him in, that whispered to him in the same voice he had heard earlier. "Help me." David reached for the book, his hands trembling. The moment his fingers touched the pages, the room seemed to shift. The walls cracked, the floor beneath his feet groaned, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic. The air grew thick with an oppressive force that pressed against his chest, suffocating him. Suddenly, a voice, clear and unmistakable, spoke from behind him. "You shouldn't have opened it." David froze. His heart stopped, his breath caught in his throat. He slowly turned around, his body stiff with fear. Standing in the doorway was the woman from the mirror, her face twisted in an expression of pure terror. She reached out toward him, her hand trembling. "You have to leave," she whispered. "It's too late." David tried to speak, but his voice failed him. He was paralyzed, unable to move as the woman's image seemed to flicker, her form distorting, becoming more shadow than flesh. And then everything went dark. David's eyes flickered open, but the world around him was no longer the same. His body ached as if he had been torn apart and stitched back together, and the room was still shrouded in a thick, suffocating darkness. He tried to move, but his limbs felt heavy, as if something was holding him in place, preventing him from escaping. The whispering voices had stopped, but their presence lingered in the air, filling the room with an unsettling stillness. He tried to speak, but his voice was strangled, as if the very air was pressing against his throat, choking him. Suddenly, he heard a soft sound, a low, dragging noise that seemed to come from the farthest corner of the room. David's heart raced. The figure of the woman was gone, but the chill in the room remained, and something else, something darker, had taken her place. He managed to lift his head slightly, his eyes scanning the room, trying to make sense of his surroundings. The altar was gone, as was the book. The symbols on the walls had faded, leaving only the cold stone beneath his feet. But there was something else now, something far more disturbing. In the center of the room, at the spot where the altar once stood, a figure now knelt. It was humanoid, but it was wrong. Its body twisted and distorted, covered in shadows that seemed to writhe and shift of their own accord. Its face was hidden, obscured by a dark hood that hung low over its head, casting its features in darkness. David's breath caught in his throat. He knew what this was, he had read about it in the book. The thing before him was not just some twisted human figure. It was a spirit, a creature of the darkness, bound to the mansion by the curse that had been unleashed. The creature began to move, slowly rising to its feet, its movements jerky and unnatural. It turned to face David, its head tilting at an odd angle, as if it were studying him. David could feel his heart pounding in his chest, his body stiff with fear. He tried to speak, to ask what it wanted, but no words came. The creature's dark, empty eyes locked onto him, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, the creature opened its mouth, and a voice that was both guttural and melodic echoed through the room. "You have awakened something you cannot control," it hissed. "You are not meant to leave this place." David's blood ran cold. He tried to back away, but his body wouldn't respond. The creature stepped forward, its movements so fluid that it seemed to glide across the floor. The shadows around it seemed to pulse, reacting to its every motion, as if they were alive, feeding off its dark energy. "You will never leave," the creature continued, its voice now a whisper that seemed to come from all directions at once. "You belong to the house now, just like the others." David's mind raced. He had to escape. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't be trapped like the others. But how? How could he fight something like this? As the creature moved closer, David's desperation grew. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, focusing all his energy on breaking free from the invisible force that held him in place. He could feel the mansion, its very walls pressing in on him, suffocating him, but there was a flicker, a brief moment of clarity. In that instant, he realized something. The creature, the house, it was all part of the curse. It fed on fear, on despair. It thrived on the souls of those who entered and were consumed by its darkness. And now he was part of it. David's eyes shot open, and for the first time since he entered the mansion, he felt something other than fear, anger. He refused to be another victim, another lost soul. He clenched his fists, the surge of determination flowing through him. With every ounce of strength he could muster, he forced his body to move. The shadows fought against him, but he pushed through them, stumbling forward. The creature hissed in frustration as David reached out for the door, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. He could hear its footsteps behind him, but he didn't look back. He had to keep moving. The door creaked open, and the world outside the mansion greeted him, a world that seemed distant, unreal, like a dream. David didn't hesitate. He ran. The mansion loomed behind him, its dark silhouette against the night sky, but he didn't look back. Not once. He had escaped, but he knew deep down that the mansion's curse would never truly let him go. It would always be waiting, lurking in the shadows, ready to claim its next victim. And as David disappeared into the night, the whispers returned, soft and insistent, echoing in the wind. David stumbled through the darkness, his breath ragged, his heart pounding in his chest. The cold air of the night felt like a distant, comforting embrace compared to the suffocating grip of the mansion. But even as he ran, the dread lingered, clawing at his back, urging him to look over his shoulder, to see if the horrors of the house were following him. His feet hit the cold earth as he pushed through the overgrown path, branches scratching at his skin like the long fingers of unseen hands. He didn't care. He had to get away, had to leave the mansion behind him. But he knew that he wasn't free. The mansion loomed in the distance, its silhouette growing darker, more menacing under the moonlit sky. It felt as if it were pulling him back, dragging him toward it, as though it had never really let him go. David collapsed against a tree, gasping for air, his hands trembling. His mind raced, replaying everything, the altar, the creature, the book. The whispers that had haunted him, the feeling that something was always watching, always waiting. His escape had been too easy, too quick. It didn't feel real. Suddenly, a sound reached his ears. Soft at first, barely a whisper, but growing louder, clearer with each passing second. The voice that had haunted him before. David. His blood ran cold. It was her voice. The woman. The one who had warned him. But how? How is she still here? David, you shouldn't have left, the voice called again, this time filled with a sense of cold, unbearable sadness. You can never leave. David's head snapped up, his eyes scanning the shadows around him. There was no one there. The woods were empty, silent, yet the voice continued, soft and mournful. The curse, it doesn't end. It never ends. David's pulse quickened. He stood, staggering to his feet, the realization crashing down on him. He hadn't escaped. The mansion's grip was still on him, even from a distance. He felt the pull, stronger now, closer, like the very earth beneath him was shifting, trying to drag him back into the depths of the darkness. David, you're one of us now. The ground beneath him trembled. He looked down to see the earth cracking, the shadows from the mansion stretching, creeping toward him like dark tendrils. The air grew thick with an unnatural cold, and David's heart raced as panic surged through him. He tried to run, to escape again, but the shadows wrapped around his legs, pulling him back, suffocating him. He screamed, struggling, fighting against the unseen force, but it was no use. The darkness was overwhelming, swallowing him whole. It wasn't just the mansion anymore, it was everything. The curse had followed him, and now it was consuming him. As the shadows enveloped him, his vision blurred, his body went numb. He could hear the whispers again, louder now, surrounding him on all sides. He could feel the weight of countless souls pressing in on him, their grief, their despair. You're never leaving, David, the voice whispered, echoing all around him. You're part of it now, forever. And then everything went silent. David's body disappeared into the darkness, his form lost within the twisted shadows of the mansion that had now claimed him as its own. The whispers faded, but the house remained, waiting for its next victim. The end.